Good afternoon. Just checking to see if you're awake, because I have the unenviable position of trying to make the Securities and Exchange Commission seem sexy and interesting. But let me start here. This is a picture of my dad, and when I was younger, he used to tell me, Ciara, remember to ask the big questions. And the big question that I've been asking for the past 6 years is, what's the proper role of corporate money in a democracy? But the question that I'm going to be posing today is, should the SEC require transparency for corporate political spending? And spoiler alert, I think the answer to this question is yes. And one of the reasons that I think the answer to this question is yes is the SEC already regulates money in politics, and I'm going to go through 3 different areas where that's already the case. One is under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and then I'll go through 2 anti-pay-to-play rules that the SEC enforces. So when I started researching the SEC, my biggest fear was boredom. And when I got the reams of papers from my research assistants, I really wanted to gouge my eyes out, and I didn't want to read those papers, but I did it for love of God and country, and I did it so that you wouldn't have to. And when I finally opened up those pages and read reams and reams of pages about the Securities and Exchange Commission, what I realized is what I was researching was a story about money and power. So the SEC entered the fray of regulating money in politics in the 1970s. And here's that story. After a famous bungled burglary here at the Watergate, these reporters decided to follow the money. Congress, of course, held investigations into Watergate, both the burglary and into Nixon's re-election campaign, and they found that the 2 were linked. One of the things that Congress realized is the burglary was paid for in part by the Committee for the Re-election of the President, otherwise known as CREEP, and CREEP got some of its money from these corporations. And the fact that the money came from the corporate treasuries of these corporations was a problem. And the problem was it was patently illegal, both then and now, under a law called the Tillman Act. So as every school child in America knows, as a result of Watergate, Nixon resigns. But what is much less known is that the Securities and Exchange Commission launched an enormous investigation into not just the corporations that were caught by the Watergate prosecutors, but they decided to expand disclosure and look at basically every publicly traded company. They asked them, have you too given to a candidate? And meanwhile, over at the Securities and Exchange Commission back in the 70s, Stanley Sporkin, who was the director of enforcement, asked his own big questions, including, how does Gulf Oil account for a $50,000 cash payment to CREEP? Do they have an account called bribery? And it turns out that was not too far off from the truth. Hundreds of U.S. corporations came forward and admitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission that they had what can only be charitably described as political slush funds, and that's the SEC's terminology, not mine. The largest political slush fund was at Gulf Oil, but Gulf Oil was far from being alone. And when the SEC looked into the matter further, what they found is not only had money gone to the Nixon re-election campaign, it had gone to several Democrats. And a significant amount of money had gone to foreign officials in what I think a layman would just call a bribe. And part of the reason that this concerned the Securities and Exchange Commission is the slush funds were at such a big level that the financials that these corporations were giving to their investors were materially misleading. And so after the SEC finds this rat's nest in the 1970s, they actually take an almost lobbyist role in advocating for a new anti-bribery law, which will become the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The FCPA is, of course, a long and complicated document, but for our purposes here, it requires that issuers keep honest books and records. And it also bans corporations, whether they are publicly traded or not, they're banned from giving bribes to foreign officials to get or keep business. So ever since 1978, the SEC has had jurisdiction under the FCPA to regulate campaign contributions that go towards foreign officials. And this is part of the law that the SEC and DOJ jointly administer, and they do enforce this part of the law. Titan had to pay a $28.5 million fine for violating this part of the FCPA for money that was funneled into the incumbent re-election campaign of the president of Benin. So let's transition from the international to the local. The SEC also regulates money and politics in the municipal bond market. And the municipal bond market is really a bit of a hot mess. One thing you should know is that it's very large. It's nearly $4 trillion. And one of the ways you could conceptualize this is when a city or a town wants something but can't afford it, they just buy it on credit. So what could possibly go wrong if you gave 50,000 different American cities and towns a credit card? One problem is if they don't have fiscal discipline, then they can borrow more than they can afford, and they can literally go bankrupt. And this isn't theoretical. This has happened in California and elsewhere. But for our purposes today, one of the things that I'm really worried about is the risk of corruption that the municipal bond market presents. If the private banks that bring municipal bonds to market get that business through pay-to-play, then there's a real huge risk for quid pro quo corruption. And I love this quote, which is from David Clapp. He is a former Goldman Sachs partner, and he describes having pay-to-play in his face, if you will. He is sitting at a dinner party. Someone comes up to him and says, "I'm raising money for this candidate. They would like $50,000 from you." And he says, "Well, I don't have $50,000 to give that candidate." And then the response back is, "Well, then you're not going to be able to do business with that candidate." So in other words, if you don't pay, you can't play in that bond market. And problems like that came to light in the early 1990s when Chair Levitt came to power under President Clinton. And he came to the job with a real passion for rooting out this type of corruption. So he asks the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board to promulgate a rule to stop pay-to-play in the municipal bond market. And they do just that. They promulgate Rule G37. The basic structure of the rule is you can, as a bond underwriter, you can either give money to a mayoral candidate or you can do municipal bond business with that city, but you can't do both at the same time. There has to be a 2-year lag between giving big campaign contributions and doing business with the city in that way. And the rule is instantly challenged on First Amendment grounds by William Blount, who's pictured here. Mr. Blount is now a guest of the state in his own in his own pay-to-play scandal, but that's another story for another day. But back in the 1990s, he challenged the rule, and his challenge was rebuffed. The DC Circuit upheld the SEC's authority here, and part of the court's reasoning was that underwriters' campaign contributions self-evidently create a conflict of interest. So ever since 1994, the SEC has had jurisdiction over pay-to-play in the municipal bond market, and they also enforced this part of the law just last year. Goldman Sachs had to pay nearly $12 million for violating this particular rule. So let's transition from the municipal bond market to the public pension fund market. Once again, the SEC has stepped in to protect the market from pay-to-play. Now, public pension funds are the retirement accounts of public workers, say your firefighters or your police. And public pension funds are massive amounts of money. For example, in the state of New York, the public pension funds on any given day is about $150 billion, but it doesn't just sit there in a bank account, it gets invested into the stock market. And investment advisors are hired by the state of New York to invest that money so that as each tranche of retirees retires, every day, there's enough money there to pay for their retirements. And this market is also huge. It is over $4 trillion, but a lot of that gets eaten up in investment fees to the tune of billions of dollars in investment fees a year. And with so much money at stake, so much money on the table, there's this temptation for elected officials who control such big pension funds to actually sell those investment opportunities in exchange for campaign contributions. And this isn't theoretical. In New York lost its comptroller to such a pay-to-play scandal. Connecticut lost its state treasurer to such a pay-to-play scandal, all about investing public pension fund money. So at the beginning of the Obama administration, the SEC showed some real leadership once again and promulgated a new rule that addresses pay-to-play in the public pension fund system. And the structure is very similar to the municipal bond rule. Basically, a underwriter can give to the governor of a state, or they can do public pension fund business for that state, but they can't do it at the same time. And in justifying the rule, the then chair of the SEC, Mary Shapiro, said pay-to-play is both corrupt and corrupting. And the good news is that the rule has already worked. And we saw this in the 2012 presidential election, where Governor Perry was the only sitting governor who was running for office. And so he was subject to actually both of the anti-pay-to-play rules that I've talked about today, which meant that investment banks had to make a choice. They could either give big to Perry's presidential run, or they could do business with the state of Texas. And if you don't want to take my word for it, this is the advice that Skadden Arps gave to its corporate clients, basically warning them, if you give big to the Perry campaign, you may have to sit out business with the state of Texas for 2 years. So all of that was a mouthful. What else is new? I think what else is new and why we need a new disclosure rule from the SEC is the rules of the game have fundamentally changed with Citizens United. Now corporations can spend an unlimited amount of their corporate treasury funds on political ads. And corporations are already using their Citizens United rights. Gulf Oil, who I referenced in relation to the Watergate scandal, is now known as Chevron. And Chevron was the biggest on-the-books publicly traded company that spent in the 2012 election. But what I'm worried about is not the on-the-books spending, it's the dark money spending that we can't see. So if you have a corporation that decides that it doesn't have the courage of its own convictions, then if it funnels its money through a 501c4 or a 501c6, then it's as if it disappeared, because the public can't see through this black box to the original corporate source. And that means that the public can't tell who the big money is behind a given political ad. And according to my friends at Demos, over $300 million in the last cycle was dark. So in response to Citizens United, 10 corporate law professors have written a petition to the SEC asking for a new rule requiring transparency of corporate political spending. And the public has really responded to this. A record-breaking 600, and now it's over, it's 600,000 plus public comments have been filed at the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is the most comments that have ever been filed on a petition at the SEC. And I would argue to you that the investing public needs to see this money before it's laundered. Thank you.